Hello and welcome to our Bible study today. I'm David Matthews. I'm with Nancy Springer, priest with the Anglican Communion. I am in the Diocese of Toronto, and Nancy is in the Diocese of West Texas, which is in the south of Texas. And we're very glad to be able to be here, mainly just again because we both love the Bible. We both love God's Word, and the opportunity to sit down and read together what God has given us as evidence of His character, of what He has done, of who He is great. It's wonderful, and to do it with a good friend is even better. So if you're joining us today, we're very glad you are. Feel free to comment on the video, start a conversation regarding about what you've heard, other questions. We will try and circle back to them and answer them in future videos or in the comments. So we're going to get started. Just as a quick reference, we're doing during this time, we're currently reading the oracles in the book of Isaiah. Some of these are a little bit, well, they're all very judgmental. Which is not necessarily a bad thing. They just are. But we're going to do, if they're not your cup of tea, we're doing a summary video of the oracles in a couple of weeks. So make sure you capture that. But of course, each video itself will cover more and be more specific. So if you're here, welcome. We're going to jump to it. I'm reading chapter 15. Nancy is going to read chapter 16. So let's jump into it. Chapter 15. An oracle about Moab. Ar was devastated in a night. Moab is ruined. Kir was devastated in a night. Moab is ruined. Dibon has gone up to the temple, to the shrines to weep. Moab wails over Nebo and over Medeba. Every head is shaved, every beard cut off. In its streets they wear mourning clothes. On its rooftops and in its plazas, everyone wails and falls down weeping. Heshbon and Elilah cry out. As far as Jahaz, their voice is heard. The armed men of Moab shout, spirits trembling. My heart cries out for Moab. Its fugitives flee to Zoar, to Eglath Shelishishar. At the ascent of Luhith, each will go up with weeping. On the roads to Horonaim, they will raise a piercing cry. The waters of Nimrim are used up. Grass has withered, vegetation is dead, greenery is gone. Therefore they carry what they had stored up, all their provisions to the valley of the willows. An outcry sounds within the borders of Moab. As far as Eglam, a cry of distress. As far as Bir Elim, a cry of distress. The waters of Dibon are full of blood, but I will bring still more upon Dibon. A lion for Moab survivors, for the remaining few in the land.
Send lambs to the ruler of the land, from Selah through the desert to the mountains of daughter Zion. The daughters of Moab at the fords of the Arnon are like orphaned birds pushed from the nest. Consider carefully, act justly. At high noon provide your shade like night. Hide the outcasts. Keep the fugitives hidden. Let the outcasts of Moab live among you. Be a hiding place for them from the destroyer. When the oppressor is no more, when destruction has ceased, when the trampler has vanished from the land, a throne will be established based on goodness, and someone will sit faithfully on it in David's dwelling, a judge who seeks justice and a timely righteousness. We have heard of Moab's pride, his great pride, his outrageous pride and arrogance, his empty boasting. Therefore, let Moab wail. Let everyone wail for Moab. Let them moan, utterly stricken, for the raisin cakes of Kir Hareseth. The fields of Heshbon languish, the vines of Sibmah, whose honored grapes, overpowered masters of nations, had reached as far as Jazer and strayed to the desert. Their tendrils spread out and crossed the sea. Therefore I will weep with Jazer, weeping for the vines of Sibmah. I will drench you with my tears, Heshbon and Eleah. Cheers have fallen silent concerning your summer fruit and your grain harvest. Joy and happiness have been harvested from the farmlands, and in the vineyards no one sings, no one shouts, no treader crushes grapes in the wine vat. I have brought the cheers to an end. Therefore my heart plays sadly like a harp for Moab, and my inner being for Kir Heres. Even if Moab presents himself and Moab wears himself out going to the shrine and comes to his sanctuary to pray, he won't prevail. This is the word that the Lord has spoken concerning Moab long ago. But now the Lord has said, in 3 years, like the years of a hired worker, the glory of Moab, with all its great multitude, will dwindle, and the small remnant will be few and feeble. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
All right.
So
Well,
historically, the nation of Moab is, we've seen it multiple times in the Bible. We see it notably, actually, very early on, as the nation of Moab is understood to be the descendants of the people of Lot. So actually, one of Lot's daughters, if you remember, she has incestual sex with her husband, with her father, and consequently, she bears the people who become the nation of Moab. And the nation of Moab is situated on the east bank of the Dead Sea. And as the people of Israel came up out of Egypt with Moses, they actually didn't go through the nation of Moab, although that's sort of where their path was. They went sort of south below what is modern day Israel, the promised land that they would be inhabiting. And then they sort of did a big loop around, and they actually came in above the nation of Moab, not having gone through it. And so here they cross the Jordan River. So obviously the nation of Moab stops before the South Sea of Galilee. So somewhere in the Jordan River there, and the nation of Israel cuts across there and into the Promised Land, right across from Jericho. So that's what we historically sort of know of the nation of Moab. Now, some other points in which prior to this oracle, Moab is important, is this is the same nation that Ruth is from, who is the grandmother of King David. And so the Ruth was a Moabitess. And this is a time where, again, the Moabites were, or rather, Israel became refugees into Moab, which is going to be a note actually here in a moment about refugees. And so Ruth then from Moab leaves Moab and then goes into Israel. So just in order to find a future along with her mother-in-law. So this is something that's important for us to note. Now, why is this prophecy happening against Moab? Well, because of their pride, it says. Well, one of the things that happened is when King Hezekiah was under threat from the nations from Assyria to the north of him, the two nations of Philistine, and Moab, they actually at this point were already uh, connected with, treated with Assyria. So when Judah was being threatened, they were all cheering and thankful and hoping that Judah would be crushed quickly and that would be the end of them. But they weren't. And so this was, of course, a great sadness to them. Now, one of the things that, of course, happens after this prophecy, we do know that eventually Moab is completely destroyed and lost. Their history can be traced as far as the Persian Empire, but at that point, they pretty much just historically drop off the map. There's nothing written about them after that point. Their name doesn't appear on any tablets or historical records. So they do sort of live a couple of kingdoms, if you will, a couple of hundred years. Uh, they survive as a nation after this point, but there does come a point in which they just cease to exist and are historically forgotten. So, Nancy, that's all I really have as far as the history for Moab. They were obviously cousins, if you will, or connected to the to the Israelites. Um, and yeah, God here does historically bring about their end.
Okay, so I'm going to throw a historical monkey wrench into things maybe here. So at the very end, in in verse 13 of chapter 16, it says, "This is the word that the Lord had spoken concerning Moab long ago, but now the Lord has said." So do we have a record in any previous writings that God has spoken these things against Moab?
You're gonna make me look for it, but yeah, there are actually prophecies or declarations against Moab in different places. Most notably in the book of Numbers. I believe it's Numbers
Okay.
chapter 21. Um, so one of the things that happens is, of course, when um, Israel is going through the Promised Land, they end up going up and around the nation of Moab. And but while they are doing this, the people of Moab stare out at the armies of Israel, and they're terrified by them. So the king of Moab calls a prophet to come and curse them or prophesy against them, and that is Balaam. And so
Yeah.
Balaam, if you remember from the book of Numbers, around Numbers chapters 21 through I think it's 24, um, they basically the king pays Balaam to prophesy or to curse Israel, and so Balaam gets his power from God, and that's a little bit of a historical oddity as to how does he get the power from God and yet use this power to curse nations, even though cursing is not of the will of God. So we'll put a pin in that one and address that another time. The point is, God is not happy with
Not happy.
Balaam, and he's not happy with Moab for doing this. So there is a declaration against Moab during this time, and at the same time a blessing for the people of Israel through this time. So that might be what it's referencing, but because it does say long ago, and this would be really long ago.
Yeah.
Um, but at the same time, it is uh, that the wording of this prophecy here spoken by Isaiah is not directly the same wording as that prophecy. So it might be referring to something extra biblical, or it might be referring to this declaration, as I said, from the book of Numbers regarding the nation of Moab, but it's unclear, but it could be either. Either way, the point is, yes. Either way, what we're left with is that this is a prophecy, and Isaiah does recognize that there has been a judgment that has been a long time in coming, and he's now saying that it's going to happen in a short period of time. Specifically, he says in 3 years this prophecy is going to be fulfilled. So, Nancy,
All right.
that's what I got
Well
for you.
done. Well done off the cuff there. So what we see theologically about who God is in this. So it just starts out, right, with just complete destruction and devastation, right? There's going to be not even any grass or vegetation left in the land, right? It is just completely wiped clean, a nation full of cries of distress. The waters will run like blood. And so just complete destruction. And yet he begins, he says in the middle of that, I mean, we keep referencing chapter and verses, but remember this was written all as one piece. Chapter and verse numbers are a modern day addition to scripture to help us literally stay on the same page. And so we can and reference each other and point to where we are. So we have this picture of complete and utter destruction, of rivers running with blood, um, and that even a lion will come for the remaining that are left. And yet we are then told by the prophet to consider carefully and act justly, right? To hide the outcasts. And I'm reading in chapter 16, verses 2 and 3 and 4, right? So consider carefully, act justly. At high noon, provide your shade like night. Hide the outcast, keep the fugitives hidden. Let the outcasts of Moab live among you, be a hiding place for them from the destroyer. Right? So God is giving everybody, is preparing everybody for this, and he's looking for people in and amongst this, right, to consider carefully and to act justly. God's not acting arbitrarily. He's using this also to give people the opportunity to stand up and do the right thing. Still to this day, as he's getting ready for total destruction. And so we go right in the prophet Micah later on says, what does God ask of us? And he asks us to love mercy, love justice,
Act justly,
walk humbly.
love mercy.
Act justly, love mercy, walk humbly with God. I knew I'd get them all three out there eventually, right? And so this act justly, do the right thing, act in righteousness. And the end of that call for who among you is still willing to be just ends with the hope of the Messiah to come, right? A throne will be established based on goodness, and someone will sit faithfully on it in David's dwelling, a judge who seeks justice and timely righteousness. And so this is what we know as the messianic hope, right? What the people of Israel would have been looking for and longing for through all of this, that God will send the ultimate king to rescue from all this destruction and this death and the oppression of the nations around them. And so even in the midst of the destruction, right, we have a call to justice and a sign of hope that all will be set right someday. And then he continues on with the conviction of Moab's pride. And again, just more like all the goodness is taken away. In verse 10, he talks about the joy and happiness have been harvested from the farmland, right? Joy and happiness are fruits of living in God's way and living justly and seeking righteousness and goodness. And all of that will be taken away, cut down and destroyed, so that no one will be singing and no one will be shouting in happiness. But there's hope.
There's hope, absolutely.
And there is a call for justice. And the very, very end, right, the very last thing said about Moab is the small remnant will be few and feeble. They'll be weak, and there'll be a few of them, but there will be a remnant that will be given the opportunity again to turn and become God's people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it doesn't necessarily say what their choice will be, but it does seem to imply that there's this choice that is given there, that this opportunity. And yeah. What do you make of verse 12 there, right? Even if Moab presents himself and Moab wears himself going out to the shrine and comes to his sanctuary to pray, he won't prevail. So I'm wondering, because I'll give you my point first, is where it says his sanctuary, I think it to mean the gods of Moab. So I think it means like they won't do any good because the gods of Moab are not really they are not powerful enough to defend from this judgment that is coming.
Right. Moab will try to seek his own salvation there, is how I'm reading that. And God says no.
Yeah, and I like the way you say that. Seek his own salvation, like save himself, right? And yeah, under the judgment of God, you cannot save yourself. That's a very New Testament understanding as well, right? We cannot save ourselves. we ultimately stand before the ire of God, the judgment of God, in certain areas of our lives and in total. For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Thank you, St. Paul.
Right.
But the recognition of, well, what do we do? And the recognition, again, as you said, we can't provide our own salvation. We can't seek our own salvation. There's only one who can, and that's you follow the mercy of the one who also holds judgment in their hand, and they're the only one who can provide your salvation.
Yeah. All right.
Awesome. Well, Nancy, that's excellent. Is there anything left that you would highlight that stood out to you as either something just of interest or a point for people to consider?
No, I think that covers what I had wanted to point out and bring up, and I just appreciate your historical knowledge and wisdom in these, and grateful that you're doing this with me.
Yeah, me too. I love the way that we're, with a friend, you're always able to bring out different sides of each other. And so
Yeah.
you're able to share what you've learned over the years, and even just in preparing to do a bit of a Bible study about something. And then you can share it with other people. That's excellent.
Yeah. Doing great. All right, well, we will continue on with the oracles in the next video. So we invite you all to keep coming back and keep sticking with it, even when it gets hard.
Absolutely. Nancy, before we go, who's the next one? Who's our next
We've
oracle?
got Damascus and Ephraim.
All right. So
Next.
Damascus being the nation of Syria and Ephraim being the northern kingdom. All right.
Yeah. And so we'll talk about those two next and move on from there.
All right. Excellent. Well, God bless you all and have a great day.
Great. Thanks. Bye.